So we are now at part 4 of our Civil War series. We are approaching the end, so I'm sure you might all be grateful. Or maybe you find this interesting. I don't know. But either way, we're at part 4 and I'm pretty sure we can get this done in 5. Maybe 6, but we're going to try for 5. Alright, so today, as you can tell from the title of the video, we're going to be talking about 2 particular battles, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Before we get into that, we do a little prefacing. How did we get to Vicksburg, so we can know why Vicksburg and Gettysburg were so important. Alright, so where did we leave off last time? Well, last time we left off at Lincoln giving the South an ultimatum. So basically either stop the fighting or rejoin the Union, or he would free all the slaves in the Confederate States. And what was this ultimatum called? The Emancipation Proclamation. Exactly. So he gave them that ultimatum, and the South didn't pay attention to it. So on January 1st of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. It frees all the slaves in the South. It does not free the slaves in the North, because remember, it's a military strategy. It is not necessarily a moral or humanitarian act, although it could have been. That could have been part of the reason, but the main reason was its military significance. So that's what we talked about in the last video. So now what does the war look like following the Emancipation Proclamation? And that's what we're going to look at today. Alright, so just before the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, so let's take it back 1 month to December of 1862. What's happening in December of 1862? Well, you'll remember a previous attempt by the Union Army when they were led by McClellan to capture Richmond. Because remember, capturing Richmond was important because Richmond was the Confederate capital. So they had tried to do that earlier. In December of 1862, they tried again. This time under a different general. This is, like I mentioned before, Lincoln goes through a lot of generals, so it is not important to us to remember all their names. It's important for us to remember that there were a lot of them. So this particular general, his name is Ambrose, sorry that I ran out of room, Burnside. That's how you spell it. Yes. Ambrose Burnside, new Union general, leads the new attack onto Richmond, or he tries to attack Richmond. It fails. Once again, he's beaten back by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So we have another failed attack. Burnside is more aggressive than McClellan. That is why Lincoln chose him to be the new general. But still, he did not strategize or plan as well as other generals did. So the army is beaten back at a town called Fredericksburg, which is right outside of Richmond. We don't have to write this down. This is just kind of context. So we have another failed attack on the Confederate capital. So this is following, so then, this battle happens, a failed attack on Richmond, and then we have a month later, the proclamation goes into effect. But even with the proclamation, Lincoln knows that he still needs to be able to win battles. So he needs to find a new general. He needs to find someone who can fight like General Lee does, a good strategist. So now he finds another general. This guy's name is Joseph Hooker. He was called Fighting Joe by his friends, which sounds like a great nickname for a general to have, but unfortunately, Joseph Hooker was everything McClellan wasn't. He was too aggressive, he was too confident, and he made a lot of mistakes as a general. So in April of 1863, so this is a battle we're going to put on our sheet. April, the official day is April 30th of 1863. Hooker attacks the Confederate forces at a town called Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville is an Eastern Virginia town. Once again, we're staying in this northern Eastern Virginia area. We're trying to eventually come in to close down on Richmond, still haven't been able to do it. Burnside fails at Fredericksburg. Hooker is going to fail at Chancellorsville. So he attacks the Confederate forces at Chancellorsville, and this is what I want you to put into your timeline sheet. I'm going to grab mine to show you which one. Should be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 box. right here, April 30th, 1863, Chancellorsville. And Hooker was more aggressive than McClellan. We kind of already said that. However, Lee was a better strategist than Hooker. So Lee was outnumbered, and he knew it. He was outnumbered by the Union forces. So what he did, instead of trying to face them face on, he splits his army into 3 different parts and sends them to surround the Union army. So they can't really tell how many men they're against. They just kind of know they're everywhere. So Lee took a gamble, and it worked. If you remember Stonewall Jackson, we learned about him in the first Battle of Bull Run. Because remember, his soldiers were standing straight and strong like a stone wall, and that's how he got his nickname. Stonewall Jackson and his forces, again, completely take out the right flank, or the right side of the Union army. And from then on, it's a Confederate victory. So the Confederates win this another attempt to get close to Richmond at Chancellorsville. So you can put a capital C in your timeline map for Confederate victory. So why am I mentioning Chancellorsville? What's the point of mentioning Chancellorsville? Because this Chancellorsville is going to be a turn in the war for the Confederates. Because I mentioned some Fredericksville before. We didn't put it on our sheet, but I mentioned Fredericksville as a Confederate victory. Chancellorsville, another Confederate victory. How are we going to see a turn in the tides to where the Union starts winning battle? Part of the reason is what happens right after the battle at Chancellorsville. So Stonewall Jackson plays a big role in winning this battle, him and his soldiers. So now the battle's over. The Confederates have won. And some Confederate soldiers are still, they're still in the battlefield, making sure there aren't any Union stragglers. And they see a group in the distance. They're not quite sure who they are, but they think they're Union soldiers. So these Confederates fire at them. And then they realize that they didn't just fire at Union soldiers. They fired at Stonewall Jackson and his aides. They fired at their own general, basically. And this turns out to be an unmitigated catastrophe. He's shot in the arm, and his arm has to be amputated. And first it looks like he's going to make a recovery. Then he catches pneumonia, and then he dies. Leaving General Lee completely devastated because he's just lost one of his best men, his best generals. And it's hard to say how much impact losing General Jackson had on Lee, but the reason why I bring up Chancellorsville is because Chancellorsville will be Lee's last great victory. From here on out, he's never going to have a victory as good as he had at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. And there are a lot of reasons for this, and I'm sure there were a lot of factors, but one of the most important ones is probably the fact that he lost his right-hand man, his best general, Stonewall Jackson. So that is why I have Chancellorsville on our sheet to remember. So if you remember, there's nothing really important to remember about Chancellorsville except that it's one of the last big Confederate victories, and it's where Stonewall Jackson is killed by accident by his own soldiers. So I'll give you a minute to put that down. So, meanwhile, so we've spent these first couple minutes of this video talking about the East, about a failed attack on Richmond, about the Emancipation Proclamation, about Chancellorsville, which happens in eastern Virginia. So this is all about the East. We haven't talked about the West in a while, since Shiloh. So what's been happening in the West all this time? Because remember, General Grant is in the West. Because if you remember, think again to our Anaconda Plan, we've been talking about the first branch of the Anaconda Plan recently, the Eastern branch. Now let's go back to the third branch, the Western branch, the one that Grant is trying to take care of. So while all this is happening in the East, Grant is still trying to work his way down through the Western Front, down through the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers. So he continues to infiltrate the Western Front. He fights several other battles that we're not going to talk about in details. But he sets his sight on one particular city that he wants to get control of. And this is where we get to the main point of today's video. This city is called Vicksburg. And let's talk for a minute about why Vicksburg is important. Why should we remember Vicksburg? So Vicksburg is a Confederate stronghold in Mississippi. Let's see if I can find it on the map. If you have your map, it should definitely be there. So find me Mississippi. It's on the border between Louisiana and Mississippi, so it's right here. You guys should have it. Great, so that's Vicksburg. It is, it overlooked the Mississippi River, so it's right on the river, and it was the only rail rail and river junction between the big cities of Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans. So what do I mean by rail and river junction? It's the only place where the river and the railroads meet between Memphis and New Orleans. So between Tennessee and Louisiana. Vicksburg is the only rail and river junction. And why is that important? Because if we're talking about transporting supplies, especially food and other war materials that the South needs, being able to reach the river by railroad is very important because they can send supplies down or up the Mississippi River and then transport it by rail to the rest of the Confederacy. So Vicksburg was hugely important to the Confederate cause. If the Union Army could take Vicksburg, they could split the Confederacy in two because they now control the Mississippi River, which kind of runs down through the Confederacy. And they'd be able to prevent them from getting food and other supplies that they needed. So, of course, Grant recognizes how important Vicksburg is, but of course the Confederacy does as well. So Vicksburg is actually very, very heavily protected. So how is Grant going to take Vicksburg? Is he going to take Vicksburg? So on May 18th of 1863, put that date down. So this is about a month after Chancellorsville. May 18th, 1863, Grant attacks Vicksburg. So let's put this date down in your 7th box up here. May 18th, 1863, Grant attacks Vicksburg, but he doesn't attack it like a battle. He lays siege to Vicksburg because the Confederates have already fortified it really well. So Grant's strategy is not to fight them or beat them to death. He wants to starve them to death, to force them out of the city. And it doesn't take long for the situation in Vicksburg starts becoming desperate. They run out of food, they start eating whatever they have, from horses, mules, rats, to even their own pets, which is really sad. But the Confederates know how important Vicksburg is, so they really, really don't want to surrender, even as it's getting desperate. So they send word to President Davis. Here, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. And Davis realizes as well that keeping Vicksburg is really, really important to the Confederate cause. So he, in turn, sends word to General Lee. Remember, General Lee is in the east. So General Lee, this is our map, is over here somewhere. Vicksburg down here, there's a long way in between. So Davis sends word to Lee. He says, look, Vicksburg is under siege. Grant has his army camped outside of Vicksburg. Vicksburg, we can't lose Vicksburg. So you need to send some of your men to help protect Vicksburg and get Grant out of there. So Lee takes that, he thinks about it, and then forever the strategist that he was says, okay, I understand this is important. However, I have another idea. I have a different idea, potentially a better idea. Instead of Lee sending his troops directly to Vicksburg, he decides, instead of marching all that way, why doesn't he make another attack on the east? A big attack. An attack so great on the north that Grant's forces would be forced to leave Vicksburg and come back to the east to potentially defend Washington, D.C. or some other territory near the capital. That could work. Maybe that would even work better than Lee marching all the way to Vicksburg from Virginia. Virginia to Mississippi is a long way. So that's his plan. And that's what he has decided he's going to do. So at this point, we've reached a very, very crucial moment because this is really important, what Lee's about to do. So the success of his campaign would either begin the destruction of the North's cause because they would lose their chance to get Vicksburg and they'd have to move their army from the west to the east, or it's going to pave the way for the end of the Southern cause because if Lee fails, Vicksburg will most likely be taken and they'll have lost a battle in the east. So which one happens? We're about to find out. So I'll give you a second if you have any questions about the setup of Vicksburg, why Lee doesn't come to Vicksburg, what's Grant trying to do. Write them down now. We will go through them next time we go through questions. All right. So what does Lee do when he attacks in the east? So it is now June of 1863, about a month into Grant's siege of Vicksburg. So Lee's Army of Northern Virginia begins to march north into Maryland and then Pennsylvania. Remember, he previously tried to march into Maryland. That's when we fought the Battle of Antietam Creek in Sharpsburg, Maryland. But then he'd been beaten back by the Union forces. So he's going up again. He's having a new campaign into the north. So in June, he starts moving his soldiers into Pennsylvania. The Union forces are under another general this time, another new general. This guy's name is General Meade. And they start pursuing Lee as he goes north into Pennsylvania. They're realizing what he's trying to do. They know that he's trying to make an attack so great that Grant's going to have to come back. And they want to make sure that doesn't happen. Then we have a couple unfortunate situations. Unfortunate for the Confederacy. Basically, to put it simply so we don't have to go into all the details, there was some miscommunication and some potential disobeying of orders on the Confederate side by some of Lee's officers. One of them was an officer by the name of Jeb Stuart, who was usually in charge of Lee's cavalry and scouts. And he's the one who should have been watching to see how many Union soldiers were following him. But instead of making sure that he kept Lee informed on Meade and his men, Jeb Stuart instead tried to go and threaten an attack on Washington, D.C., kind of on his own. There was miscommunication. Or maybe he just disobeyed orders. It's kind of hard to tell now. But whatever happened, Jeb Stuart, Lee's scout, officer in charge of the scouts, was not there when he was needed. And therefore, Lee didn't really know exactly how many Union soldiers were following him and his men. And this proves to be a disastrous oversight. So at dawn, on June 30th of 1863, the Confederate troops enter a hilly farming town by the name of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And this is a name you've probably heard before in reference to the Civil War, because we all know what the Gettysburg Address is. We're about to find out why Lincoln had to make the Gettysburg Address. So when, on June 30th, Confederate forces arrive at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, they immediately clash with Union cavalry. And this is cavalry that's been following them this entire time. It takes about a day for the rest of the parts of the army to follow. Because the armies are big. They have cavalry, they have foot soldiers, they have people wielding cannons. So it takes about a day after the initial clash with the cavalry for all the army to come together. Which is why the official start date of this battle is July 1st. So let's put that in our sheet. We've almost filled it, so this is our second to last box. You can put June 30th or July 1st, either one is fine. Gettysburg, 1863. And you might think, oh, we haven't put who won Vicksburg. Well, because we don't know yet. We don't know who's won Vicksburg yet, so you have to wait for that, because Gettysburg will influence what happens at Vicksburg. So, what happens on July 1st? The battle officially begins on July 1st. And it happens much like a lot of other battles in the war have happened up to this point. The Confederates are winning at first, as they always seem to. They have the upper hand in the beginning of the battle, but then Union soldiers regroup, and General Meade arrives with his reinforcements, the ones who have been following Lee at a distance all this time. So they're ready in this situation to help the Union soldiers who are at first losing. And then the battle starts taking a turn. So by the second day of fighting, 16,000 men were killed just on the second day alone, and the battle goes on for another day. So this is, once again, the reason why you have such a commemoration around the Battle of Gettysburg. It was not just because it's a turning point in the war, but because of how many lives are lost there, and they're lost in such close proximity to D.C., like Antietam. So on July 3rd, so we're 3 days into the battle now, Lee makes a desperate move because he can tell the tide isn't going in his favor. And he assaults a well-defended Union line along a part of the battlefield called Cemetery Ridge. And the reason I mention this is because if any of you ever happen to visit Gettysburg, you might have already, or if you see pictures, Cemetery Ridge is one of the most important sites on the battle, one of the most commemorative sites on the battlefield, because of Lee's infamous charge at Cemetery Ridge. he probably knew that it wasn't going to be successful, but it was the only thing he could try. So he charges up this ridge known as Cemetery Ridge. There will be a picture in the PowerPoint that I'll show you, or I'll direct you to. And they do it with all the force they have, but the Union soldiers are committed to not letting the Confederates pass, and the Confederates won't stop because they know if they lose now, they've lost a very, very important battle. But this is not just about Gettysburg, this is also about Vicksburg. So then we have kind of a break in the battle. When a battle goes on for this long, fighting sometimes periodically stops for a little bit and then rejoins. So it stops for a little bit after this first rush up Cemetery Ridge, and then we have the second rush up Cemetery Ridge. But at this point, it's almost a suicide rush, like a final attempt by the Confederates to try and win this battle. But they know it's going to fail. So the Confederates rush up Cemetery Ridge again, are met with, I think, numbers are approximately 120 Union cannons, and thousands of riflemen are waiting for them at the top behind a low stone wall as they come up this ridge, and most of them are killed almost instantly. And that's when the Battle of Gettysburg is effectively over. And it's a Confederate loss and a Union victory. So if you go to your sheet, under Gettysburg, we want to put a U for Union victory. So they retreat. The Confederates start retreating back across the battlefield, back over. Other soldiers and letters they wrote describe the field as being blanketed with dead bodies, both of Confederates and of Union soldiers. It was so many people were killed that some families lost all the male members of their families in that one battle because they were all fighting in the same branch of the army. And as they left the battle, Union and Confederate commanders alike didn't feel like anything in the world was worth the amount of carnage that they saw at Gettysburg. And it starts making them rethink the war and the direction it's taking. So if we're looking at a final body count of Gettysburg, why is Gettysburg remembered the way it is? A final estimation is 42,000 dead, wounded, or missing after day 3, after the 3 days spent at Gettysburg. 3 days of battle, 42,000 men lost. Okay, so I paused it a second. This is why this is a different cut piece, because I need to print something else out that we're going to read in a few seconds together. But, as I was saying, in the 3 days that the Battle of Gettysburg lasted, 42,000 soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or missing in action. So that's an incredible amount of carnage in just a few days. And what was the result of Gettysburg? What happened after the fighting stopped? Lee's army, so the Army of Northern Virginia, retreats from Pennsylvania just like they retreated from Maryland after the Battle of Antietam. So once again, Lee fails to have a successful campaign as he invades the North. And it once again is similar to Antietam, because you'll remember, after Antietam, McClellan failed to follow Lee's soldiers as they retreated. Lincoln got very upset with him. In a similar style, General Meade, the Union general at Gettysburg, also fails to follow Lee again as Lee retreats from Pennsylvania. So once again, an opportunity to end the war had been wasted by, as some would say, the incompetence of Union commanders. And Lincoln was once again outraged, and he famously said, "We had them within our grasp. Your golden opportunity is gone." And unbelievably, or perhaps believably, when we think about how he doesn't chase the Confederates, the war continues on for another 2 years. But it was 2 years that are spent in a slow decline for the Confederacy. Because, like we said before, Chancellorsville was Lee's last major victory. And we can see this very clearly, seeing how badly he loses at Gettysburg. So that is the infamous Battle of Gettysburg. 4 months later, in November of 1863, Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, which we've probably all heard of before, at the site of this battle, creating and dedicating the Soldiers' National Cemetery to all the men, all 42,000 of them, who had perished at Gettysburg. So if you can, you should have, I don't remember if I printed this for you or not, it may be in your packets, or it may not be. because I gave you the packet that has the 2 inaugural addresses in it, and I think it has the Gettysburg address in the end. If it doesn't, you can find this in our Google Drive. So I'll give you a second to find that, because we're going to read it together now. So hopefully you have it in some capacity. If not, I'm going to read it. So if you can't find it, that's fine. Just listen. So 4 months after Gettysburg, 4 months after 42 soldiers die on the battlefield, Lincoln comes to dedicate a cemetery at the spot. And he gives this short speech, which the first 2 lines you've probably heard many different times before. But let's read it together. So 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And remember, he's making this statement following his own Emancipation Proclamation. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here, to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And this was given on November 19th of 1863. So what exactly is Lincoln saying in this speech? It's short. It's to the point. It's a lot shorter than his 2 inaugural addresses that we're also going to read. His biggest point when he makes this speech is that whatever he might have to say and whatever anybody else might have to say as they dedicate the ground, they can't dedicate it any more than it already has been by the lives of those who died fighting on the territory. And he says that it's not for the living to continue to try to dedicate the ground, but we need to be dedicated to finishing what they were trying to do as they fought on this ground. And that's his whole purpose in this short speech. And that's seemingly what Lincoln tries to do as he continues making decisions that lead towards the eventual end of the Civil War in about 2 years, a year and a half, I think, from this point. So that's an important thing to remember, and that's why Gettysburg is studied. That's why Gettysburg is important, because it marks not only a turning point from a military perspective, it marks a turning point in the attitude of the nation towards the war because of this public display of acknowledging that turning point by Lincoln when he makes this speech at Gettysburg. Okay, but let's also not forget why we started talking about Gettysburg to begin with. Why was Gettysburg fought to begin with? What was the point of Lee marching his men into Pennsylvania and starting the fight at Gettysburg? Remember, Gettysburg was all just a plan to distract Grant's soldiers who were attacking Vicksburg. So we have this whole big dramatic ending up almost inspiring those following this terrible battle of Gettysburg. But Gettysburg wasn't even supposed to be the whole point. Gettysburg was not the big idea to begin with. It was always all about Vicksburg. Vicksburg, the rail and river junction, the only one between the major cities of Memphis and New Orleans. So now that we know Gettysburg was a Union victory, we can finally fill in who won Vicksburg. Because we wrote Vicksburg already, we didn't wrote who won. And we talked about how if Lee lost his Eastern campaign, Vicksburg would be lost too. And that is exactly what happened. So on July 4th, ironically the 4th of July, Lee's forces are retreating from Gettysburg. But also the Confederates at Vicksburg are surrendering to General Grant. So in the space of just a few days, from the beginning of the Battle of Gettysburg to the end, the Confederates not only are driven back from Pennsylvania into the South for pretty much the final time, the Union Army had also taken control of the Mississippi River and pretty much of most of the Western Front. A couple months later, Grant fights another battle at a Tennessee river port called Chattanooga, and then he takes control of the Tennessee River too, and then with that, plus Vicksburg, he basically takes control of the entire Western Front of the war. The Confederates don't fight much on the Western Front anymore after Vicksburg and Chattanooga. We're not going to talk about Chattanooga anymore because that's not particularly important. If you want to remember anything about the Western Front of the Civil War, remember Vicksburg. And remember that Gettysburg only happened because Lee was trying to defend Vicksburg from afar. So the Confederacy is now effectively split into two because the Union Army controls the Mississippi River that runs along the Confederacy. So you have Confederacy on both sides of it, but they're now split and there's really no effective way for them to get supplies from one side to the other. And the third branch of the Anaconda Plan had succeeded, and the South can see itself falling apart slowly but surely. Okay, so this sounds all good, right? Union victories at Gettysburg, Union victories at Vicksburg. Things seem to be going well for the Union in 1863. So why does the fighting continue for 2 more years? Is probably the biggest question right now. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next video. So take time to write any questions. We'll take them during our next Zoom session. And good luck. See you in the next video.